Imagine a place where the air itself sound, a phenomenon locals call the whisper of stars. This is Oymyakon, Russia, where temperatures plunge to unimaginable lows, making mere survival a daily triumph. But it's not the only place on Earth pushed to its limits.
From volcanic islands to frozen tundras, these are the 13 most isolated places on Earth that you've likely never heard of. Number 13. Tristan da Cunha, located in the South Atlantic Ocean. Tristan da Cunha is widely considered the most remote inhabited island in the world. It sits roughly 1,500 miles from the nearest land, deep in the South Atlantic.
The island has a population of around 250 people, all living in its only settlement, Edinburgh of the Seven Seas.
There's no airport whatsoever, making access incredibly challenging. The only way in or out is by boat, a journey that typically takes about 6 days from Cape Town. These trips are scheduled only a handful of times per year, making spontaneous visits impossible.
The island was first permanently settled in 1816, when a British military garrison was stationed there.
This was to prevent the island from being used as a base to rescue a prominent historical figure from his exile on St. Helena.
St. Helena sits roughly 1,300 miles away, a significant distance even for a military operation. A small number of soldiers and settlers remained after the garrison was withdrawn. The population has descended largely from those original families, plus a handful of shipwreck survivors.
In 1961, a volcanic eruption from the Queen Mary's Peak volcano forced the entire population to evacuate.
They were evacuated to England for nearly 2 years, sheltering in a former Royal Air Force base.
Geologists assessed whether the island would remain habitable at all. Most residents chose to return rather than remain in Britain permanently once the immediate danger passed. A decision that surprised some observers, given how much more convenient daily life would have been in England. This speaks to how deeply attached the island's small, tightly knit community is to a place most outsiders would consider unbearably remote. Tristan da Cunha now functions as a British overseas territory.
It has its own currency stamps and postal service, prized by international collectors.
The island depends heavily on crayfish exports and a tightly limited tourism quota for its modest economy.
The island has no airport, and almost certainly never will. The terrain is considered too mountainous and unstable for a runway to be safely constructed, meaning the 6-day boat journey remains, for the foreseeable future, the only realistic way in or out.
Visiting requires advance permission from the Island Council, and most travellers, understandably, never get the chance.
A former island administrator once described the place as somewhere that makes you understand what isolation actually means.
Makes you understand what isolation actually means, rather than just what the word suggests.
This seems like a fair assessment from someone who's actually lived there. Number 12. Socotra Island, Yemen. Socotra sits in the Indian Ocean, roughly 240 miles off the coast of Yemen. And 150 miles from the Horn of Africa, its isolation has produced one of the most biologically unique ecosystems on the planet. Around a third of Socotra's plant species exist nowhere else on Earth. The most famous being the dragon's blood tree, an umbrella-shaped tree with red sap. This has made the island look, to many visitors, like the set of a science fiction film, rather than an actual place.
The island's isolation is both geographic and political. 18. Yemen's ongoing civil war has made travel to mainland Yemen extremely dangerous. This has complicated access to Socotra itself, even though the island has remained largely separate from the worst of the mainland conflict.
The island briefly came under the control of forces backed by the United Arab Emirates in 2018.
This was amid a dispute over administrative control, adding another layer of political complication to an already difficult-to-reach destination. The roughly 60,000 residents of Socotra live primarily through fishing, livestock herding, and date cultivation.
They are largely disconnected from the modern infrastructure most of the world takes for granted. Paved roads only reached significant parts of the island in the 2000s. UNESCO designated Socotra a World Heritage Site in 2008.
Citing both its unique biodiversity and the relative isolation that allowed so many endemic species to survive undisturbed.
For millions of years, what wonders might still be hidden from us?
Number 11. Pitcairn Island, in the South Pacific Ocean.
Pitcairn Island holds the distinction of being the least populous national jurisdiction in the world.
With a population that has hovered around just 40 to 50 people in recent years.
The island is famous as the place where the mutineers from the British naval ship HMS Bounty settled in 1790. They settled along with several Tahitian men and women, after taking command of the vessel from a historical ship captain,
and setting him adrift in a small boat with a handful of loyal crew members. The mutineers chose Pitcairn specifically because it was misplaced on contemporary nautical charts, making it nearly impossible for the British Navy to locate and arrest them. At same remoteness, located roughly 1,300 miles from Tahiti and over 3,000 miles from the nearest major landmass.
This has kept the island isolated for the more than 2 centuries since.
There is no airstrip on Pitcairn, and the only access is by boat. Typically a supply ship that makes the journey from Mangareva in French Polynesia a handful of times per year, with the trip itself taking around a day and a half in open ocean. The island's population, descended almost entirely from the original mutineers and their Tahitian companions, has declined steadily for decades due to emigration to New Zealand and elsewhere. The British government has periodically offered incentive programs, including free land grants, to attract new settlers, just to keep the community functioning at a viable size. Pitcairn's isolation became globally notorious in the early 2000s when a series of sexual abuse trials were conducted. These trials, conducted partly on the island itself, with judges and legal staff flown in specifically for the proceedings. They revealed decades of crimes within the small, insular community.
7 men were ultimately convicted in 2004, representing a significant portion of the island's adult male population at the time.
A dark chapter that demonstrated, in the most uncomfortable way possible, exactly what can happen when a population is this cut off. Despite that grim history, Pitcairn has continued to function, drawing a small trickle of tourists each year. Tourists make the considerable journey specifically to see where the Bounty mutineers ended up.
They walk among descendants who still carry surnames like Christian and Young, directly traceable to the original mutiny,
and visit the wreck site of the Bounty itself.
The Bounty was deliberately burned and sunk in Bounty Bay, shortly after the mutineers arrived in 1790.
Number 10. Oymyakon, Russia.
Oymyakon, a village in the Sakha Republic of Far Eastern Russia, holds the record for the lowest recorded temperature. In any permanently inhabited settlement on Earth, a reading of -90 degrees Fahrenheit was recorded in 1933.
With some claims of even colder, unofficial readings since.
The village, home to roughly 500 people, sits in a valley that traps cold air with brutal efficiency. And average winter temperatures regularly fall well below -50 degrees Fahrenheit for sustained periods. The isolation here isn't measured only in distance, but in survivability. Oymyakon is accessible primarily via the aptly nicknamed Road of Bones, a highway built using forced labor from Soviet Gulag prisoners during the Stalin era, many of whom reportedly died during construction and were buried beneath the road itself. The nearest city of any real size, Yakutsk, sits about 600 miles away.
And the journey between the two can take days, depending on road conditions, which deteriorate severely in winter.
And residents of Oymyakon have adapted their entire way of life around the extreme cold.
Cars are kept running continuously, rather than risk engines freezing solid and becoming impossible to restart.
And the local cemetery requires fires to be built, simply to thaw the ground enough to dig graves. A process that can take hours before excavation can even begin. Eyelashes freeze solid within minutes outdoors, and residents describe a specific phenomenon locals call the whisper of stars. A faint crackling sound produced when a person's exhaled breath freezes instantly in the air around them. A 2013 documentary crew that visited described pen ink freezing solid within minutes of stepping outside, rendering ordinary writing tools useless, and locals matter-of-factly mentioned that exposed skin can experience severe cold-related discomfort in under 10 minutes. During the coldest stretches of winter, which typically run from December through February. Despite the brutal conditions, the village has maintained a school, a small hospital, and basic services. For its roughly 500 residents, most of whom work in reindeer herding, hunting, or fishing through ice holes. Then maintaining a way of life that has persisted in this exact spot for generations, despite or perhaps stubbornly because of the conditions. Conditions that would be considered simply uninhabitable almost anywhere else on the planet.
What does it take to endure such isolation and cold, year after year?
Number 8. Motuo County, Tibet, China.
Motuo County, located in the Tibet Autonomous Region of China, was for decades known as the last county in China without road access. Construction efforts were repeatedly destroyed by landslides, flooding, and the area's severe seismic activity. Before that road existed, reaching Motuo required a multi-day trek across the Himalayan foothills. Crossing the Dokseongla Pass at elevations exceeding 13,000 feet. A journey dangerous enough that it claimed lives among both travelers and porters over the years. The county sits in a deep valley carved by the Yarlung Sangpo River, known downstream as the Brahmaputra.
And the combination of extreme elevation changes, dense subtropical forest at lower elevations, and near-constant landslide risk.
This created a level of isolation that persisted well into the 21st century.
Even as most of the rest of China rapidly modernized its infrastructure.
Local Buddhist tradition regards Motu as a hidden holy land, a paradise sealed off from the outside world. a belief that took on an almost literal quality, given how genuinely difficult the area was to physically access for so long. Even with the new road, Motuo remains one of the least populated and most geographically isolated counties in China. Home to fewer than 15,000 people across a sprawling, densely forested territory. The region's isolation preserved both unique biodiversity and distinct cultural practices among its largely ethnic Mompa and Loba population, communities that maintain traditions with minimal outside influence for far longer than nearly anywhere else in modern China.
Number 7. Whittier, Alaska, USA.
Whittier, Alaska is a small town of around 270 people that exists in a state of physical isolation, unusual even by Alaskan standards, because nearly the entire population lives inside a single building, Begich Towers.
A 14-story former military facility built in 1956 houses the overwhelming majority of Whittier's residents,
along with the town's police station, post office, grocery store, and a church, all accessible without ever having to step outside, which matters considerably given the brutal winter weather the town regularly experiences. The town averages roughly 200 inches of snowfall annually, with some winters bringing considerably more. And structural isolation from outside infrastructure has created an unusually self-contained community.
One frequently profiled by journalists and documentary filmmakers.
Fascinated by the idea of an entire town functioning largely within the walls of a single Cold War-era apartment building.
Perched at the edge of Prince William Sound.
Children in Whittier reportedly walk through an underground tunnel connecting Begich Towers directly to the town's school, meaning that during the harshest stretches of winter, an entire generation of kids can complete a full school day without ever stepping into the outside weather at all.
The town's isolation from the rest of Alaska is geographic and deliberately engineered.
Number 6. Adak Island, Alaska, USA.
Far out along the Aleutian Island chain, closer to Russia than to most of mainland Alaska, sits Adak Island.
Home to fewer than 200 permanent residents living amid the remnants of what was once a substantial U.S. Naval Air Station. The base, established during World War II and significantly expanded throughout the Cold War, was a strategic listening and defense post. Given its proximity to the Soviet Union, it once supported a population of several thousand military personnel and their families.
Before the Navy closed the facility in 1997, what remains is a small civilian community, occupying buildings designed for a population many times its current size. An entire abandoned subdivision of empty military housing, a shuttered movie theater, and infrastructure built to support thousands.
Now serving barely a couple hundred people.
The island sits roughly 1,200 miles from Anchorage, with commercial flights operating only a few times per week, and frequently subject to cancellation due to the area's notoriously violent and unpredictable weather. Driven by the collision of Pacific and Bering Sea weather systems.
Adak's remaining residents support themselves primarily through commercial fishing and a modest amount of military contracting work.
Alongside hunting feral caribou that were introduced to the island decades ago and have since thrived. The island's combination of abandoned Cold War infrastructure, extreme weather, and genuine physical distance from anything resembling a city has made it one of the more surreal inhabited places in the entire United States, a ghost town that never fully emptied out.
Number 5. Kerguelen Islands, French Southern Territories.
The Kerguelen Islands, sometimes nicknamed the Desolation Islands, a name bestowed by their own discoverer in 1772.
Which tells you most of what you need to know. They sit in the southern Indian Ocean, roughly 2,000 miles from Madagascar and over 2,300 miles from Australia.
There is no permanent civilian population. There is no permanent civilian population.
They are stationed there to study the island's unique wildlife and conduct meteorological and geophysical research.
The islands experience consistently violent weather, with winds regularly exceeding hurricane force.
And almost no days passing without some form of rain, snow, or sleet.
Conditions that have made any kind of permanent settlement essentially impossible throughout recorded history.
Despite repeated attempts at establishing whaling and sealing operations during the 19th century,
several of those historical operations failed outright or were abandoned due to the brutal, unrelenting conditions, leaving behind shipwrecks and ruins that remain scattered across the coastline today.
Access to Kerguelen is tightly restricted by the French government,
which administers the islands as part of the French southern and Antarctic lands. And travel there is essentially limited to scientific personnel arriving aboard supply ships that make the journey from Réunion roughly 4 times per year.
The islands host one of the largest king penguin colonies in the world, alongside massive elephant seal populations.
thriving entirely undisturbed by the kind of human presence that exists almost everywhere else on Earth.
Number 4. Itokortormit, Greenland.
Itokortormit is a small settlement on the eastern coast of Greenland, home to around 350 people.
And it sits beside the Scoresby Sund, the largest and longest fjord system in the world.
The settlement is widely considered one of the most isolated permanently inhabited towns on Earth.
Separated from Greenland's capital, Nuuk, by roughly 500 miles of largely uninhabited terrain.
With no road connection whatsoever between them. Even flights are limited and frequently disrupted by extreme weather. With the small airport occasionally closed for days at a time during severe storms.
Leaving residents genuinely cut off until conditions improve.
The community survives largely through subsistence hunting of seals, polar bears, and muskoxen, alongside fishing, maintaining traditions that have sustained Inuit populations in the region for centuries, despite the punishing isolation.
Number 3. Alert, Nunavut, Canada.
Alert, located on Ellesmere Island in Canada's Nunavut territory, holds the distinction of being the northernmost permanently inhabited settlement in the world. Sitting just 508 miles from the North Pole, it is not a town in any conventional sense.
There is no permanent civilian population at all. Alert exists exclusively to support a Canadian Forces Signals Intelligence Station.
And an Environment Canada weather monitoring facility, staffed by rotating military and civilian personnel, who typically serve postings of around 6 months at a time before being rotated out. The station experiences roughly 4 months of continuous darkness each winter, and a corresponding stretch of continuous daylight each summer. Conditions that staff describe as requiring genuine psychological adjustment, particularly during the long winter darkness.
When artificial lighting and structured daily routines become essential, simply to maintain a functional sense of time.
Temperatures regularly drop below -30 degrees Fahrenheit, and resupply depends almost entirely on scheduled military flights. Since no roads connect Alert to anywhere else, and sea access is blocked by ice for the overwhelming majority of the year. Number 1. McMurdo-Vostok Corridor, Antarctica. At the absolute extreme end of human isolation sits Vostok Station, a Russian research facility located in the interior of Antarctica. Roughly 800 miles from the geographic South Pole and even farther from any coastline.
Vostok holds the record for the coldest temperature ever recorded on Earth's surface, negative 128.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Vostok holds the record for the coldest temperature ever recorded on Earth's surface, negative 128.6 degrees Fahrenheit.
They endure conditions that make even Oymyakon look comparatively mild. Vostok sits atop Lake Vostok, an enormous freshwater lake buried beneath more than 2 miles of solid ice, sealed off from the surface and from contact with the outside world for an estimated 15 million years.
Before Russian scientists successfully drilled through to it in 2012.
An achievement that required decades of careful planning to avoid contaminating one of the most genuinely isolated bodies of water on the entire planet.
The lake's isolation is so complete that researchers have found microbial life forms within it that had evolved in total separation from the rest of Earth's biosphere for that entire span, raising genuine scientific interest in what the discovery might suggest about the potential for similar life. Surviving beneath the ice of moons like Europa or Enceladus, elsewhere in the solar system. Reaching Vostok requires flying into McMurdo Station on Antarctica's coast and then traveling overland or by additional aircraft,
Deep into the continent's frozen interior.
a logistical undertaking so demanding that the station can only be resupplied and staffed during the brief Antarctic summer months, typically between November and February, leaving winter crews entirely cut off from any possibility of rescue or resupply for months at a stretch.
Medical emergencies during the winter isolation period have historically required improvised solutions.
Distance dug strange things to the human imagination, and these 13 places prove that even now, in a world that feels...
If you enjoyed this one, hit like and subscribe. There's plenty more to explore.